There's nothing advanced about these wars. It's Game Boy Works Episode 6. For the most part, Game Boy Works Color will be focusing on US releases, with Japan-only titles taking a backseat to minimize the total video minutes squandered on mahjong and horse racing games. That said, some Japan exclusives are worth exploring, and Game Boy Wars 2 is one of them. Game Boy Wars 2 was the fourth entry in the Intelligent Systems developed Wars franchise, or if you prefer, the fifth. The first Game Boy Wars was reissued by Hudson in 1997 as Game Boy Wars Turbo, a sort of expansion that added some new maps and faster, smarter computer AI to the mix. The Wars games wouldn't make their way to the US until 2001 with Advance Wars, a game about conflict and warfare that, in an uncomfortable coincidence, launched in America on September 10, 2001. From that point on, the series became a bit of a fixture worldwide, but as of 1998, the Wars games were still Japan-only releases. Interestingly, despite essentially being a Nintendo first-party franchise, Game Boy Wars 2 and its 2001 sequel, Game Boy Wars 3, were also published by Hudson. Turbo had presumably been licensed by Hudson as a way to leverage the company's GB KISS infrared tech for multiplayer matches, and they retained that feature for both Game Boy Wars 2 and 3. Nintendo would offer a similar feature of their own on Game Boy Advance with an add-on wireless adapter, but Hudson's GB KISS transmission device was integrated into the carts themselves. The company's love of weirdo Game Boy carts would reach its preposterous peak with Robopon, which we'll see in a few episodes from now, but the added cost involved in creating these specialized cartridges probably helps explain why it would still be a few years before the Wars series made its way west. Then again, it could also be that the Wars games weren't quite ready for prime time. For those whose entry point into Intelligent Systems Wars franchise was Advance Wars, Game Boy Wars 2 feels disappointingly sparse. Although you'll find the basics here, turn-based military combat involving two factions called the Red Star and White Moon armies, Game Boy Wars 2 is lacking in many of the niceties that would be rolled into the series beginning with its Game Boy Advance debut. There's no story-based campaign here, no overarching plot, and definitely no charismatic commanders to rally behind. Instead, what you have amounts to a few dozen maps and scenarios to complete in either single-player or head-to-head mode. There's certainly no shortage of content here because each map can take an hour or more to complete, but if you're looking for motivation to take on these maps besides go win, you'll be disappointed. The in-game info is decidedly sparse too. Game Boy Wars 2 launched the same year as Final Fantasy Tactics, which set a new standard for rich user interfaces in console strategy games. You can definitely tell Square's work hadn't yet percolated into the larger medium. When you select a unit to move here, you see its current status and the range of its movements, but that's really about it. There are some genres that have stagnated or even gotten worse through the years, but strategy games are not one of those. It can be difficult to go back to older strategy games like this because the genre's quality of life has improved so dramatically over time. For a 1998 vintage handheld strategy game though, Game Boy Wars 2 offers a lot of content, and it plays fairly well. It works pretty much the same as Intelligent Systems' previous Wars titles, which stretch back a decade to the Japan-only Famicom Wars on, yes, Nintendo's Famicom. Players take command of an army with the aim of either defeating an enemy army or claiming control over the critical resource points of a map. Unlike Intelligent Systems' other strategy franchise, Fire Emblem, the Wars games hew closer to the 4X format. There's not really any exploration here, but you definitely need to concern yourself with resource management. You can invest cash into creating new units with each round of play, and the more ground you own, the more you can spend at once. There are a lot of units to work with here. At its most basic, you have infantry units, small and fragile but capable of passing through dense ground cover that can block vehicular units. At the other extreme, you have long-range missile launchers, submarines for stealth warfare, and even planes capable of jamming enemy radar. Naturally, the more powerful or complex a unit, the more money it costs to create. Since the interface is a little iffy about providing in-game info on the options available for each unit, there's a lot to memorize here, or at least a track on a cheat sheet. There's no shame in it. Regardless of which units you purchase though, combat operates around the same basic mechanic, which you'll recognize from Advance Wars. When two units from the opposing armies come into conflict, they'll face off in a tiny mini-scene in which you witness the devastation they wreak upon each other. Each unit begins with a deployment value of 10, and these values represent both a sort of combined hit point total and attack strength. As a unit comes into conflict with opponents, their deployment value is reduced based on the amount of damage they suffer in combat. Once a unit reaches 0, it's wiped out and removed from battle. Different unit types have a set level of effectiveness against one another, which is then modified based on the overall health of each unit involved. For example, a full-strength tank unit can chew through a full-strength infantry unit. A damaged tank unit hobbling along with a single point of health, however, won't do much good against a fresh infantry battalion. On the other hand, a bazooka-toting mechanized infantry squad represents a real threat to light vehicles, but those short-range rockets won't do much good against AWACS. There are a lot of factors at work in each battle, and knowing the best strategy to employ and the optimal resources to develop is a huge part of the game. The nature of the conflicts changes from map to map, too. A dense circular island lined by mountains demands a different approach than a crescent-shaped island surrounding a large bay, or a sprawling mass of dry land, or an archipelago of tiny islands, or a forested expanse dotted by small lakes. Each map can be played solo against a CPU or against another player. You can choose from a handful of options, including setting different CPU skill levels and toggling battle animations. With 54 maps total, a third of which only become available after completing the entire campaign, and built-in wireless multiplayer, Game Boy Wars 2 was a cut above contemporary portable strategy games. Still, the advances offered by more powerful handhelds, with faster CPUs and more expansive screen resolutions, would allow tremendous improvements to mobile turn-based strategy games over the following decade, which means that Game Boy Wars 2 hasn't aged especially well. Unlike the earlier Fire Emblem titles, this game doesn't seem to have captured the imagination of fanatical Nintendo devotees. There's very little English language info about Game Boy Wars 2 online, and the one existing fan translation patch doesn't even cover the sparse post-game content. It probably doesn't help that Intelligent Systems' big plans for Game Boy Wars 2 never quite came to fruition. The studio had intended to integrate a cross-link between this game and the series' N64 release, 64 Wars. There is just one problem with that: 64 Wars never shipped. So Game Boy Wars 2 ends up suffering a bit of middle child syndrome. Lost to time, it's neither a foundational work for the franchise like Famicom Wars was, nor is it refined and familiar the way Advance Wars is. It's a respectable piece of content for the young Game Boy Color with full backward compatibility for Game Boy and Super Game Boy, but there's honestly no reason to revisit it 20 years later outside of the historical curiosity factor. Meanwhile, this week's backup title is something we're going to see a lot of on Game Boy Works Color. It's a monster collecting role-playing game that shipped in two separate but largely identical versions. Does that sound familiar? Yes, at the same time that Pokémon Red and Blue were finally making their debut in the US, the Japanese market was being inundated by clones. The first of these for Game Boy Color would come from Tosei and Imagineer, two companies known for workman-like productions rather than standout works of imagination. And that's exactly what you have here. Sanrio Time Net comes in two versions, Mirai Hen and Kako Hen, or Future and Past. The overall formula is pretty similar to Pokemon's, with an elderly man entreating you to go forth and capture many monsters. In this case, however, the point of collecting critters is a bit different. You're not out to prove your mettle as a trainer, but rather you're gathering up creatures in order to save the Pillar of Time. In other words, where Pokemon is about collecting for collecting's sake, Sanrio Time Net sends you out to gather monsters as part of a larger quest. From what I understand, you need to collect 161 monsters in order to save time. But the weird thing is that they don't have to be 161 different monsters. Instead, you just need to round up 161, which is just as well. If you want to catch them all here, you'll need to do the standard dual version thing and link 2 copies of the game in order to trade or whatever. So there's no surprise. About the most notable thing Sanrio Time Net does in terms of gameplay is simplify its combat systems and the Pokémon type system. The battle system uses a menu interface borrowed from Super Mario RPG, wherein pressing different directions with the D-pad activates different skills, including attack, item, or run. The typing here is more of a rock, paper, scissors setup versus the dozen or more interlinking elemental types of Pokémon, which perhaps fits the kid-friendly nature of this game as a Sanrio licensed product. Yes, that's the same Sanrio as you'd think. Both versions of Sanrio Time Net contain dozens of familiar Sanrio characters to interact with, but perhaps not in the way you'd expect from this kind of RPG. If you're expecting to capture Hello Kitty or Dear Daniel and force them to do combat for you, Sanrio Time Net will disappoint. Only all new characters appear as collectible monsters, while beloved Sanrio personalities like Batsmaru show up as non-player characters around the world. Kitty, for example, appears alternately as a nurse or a shopkeeper. The only exception to this rule apparently is Hangyodon, a fishman-looking dude who reportedly appears as a rare encounter in a post-game combat area. I say reportedly because this is a rather involved pair of games that don't offer a particularly compelling argument for being played extensively for a quick review. These are Pokémon clones, pure and simple, never released outside Japan, and notable strictly for their connection to the enormous Sanrio merchandise empire. The characters you do collect and fight here are weirdos made up for this specific game, and they're not exactly up to Sanrio's standards of marketability. The starter characters in Kakohen, for example, consist of a ghost, a cheerful vacuum cleaner, and a living poop wearing diapers. We'll see plenty of games like this throughout Game Boy Works Color, some of which even made their way into English. Currently, Sanrio Time Net has only been partially and somewhat roughly localized by way of a fan effort that appears to have given up the ghost several years back. Overall, though, it seems like an okay, if slight take on the Pokémon concept, but its connections to its license are pretty tenuous. There are better ways to get your monster gathering fix on Game Boy Color.